The South Florida Water Management District is paying $8.10 an hour to hunt the slithering creatures. They say the hunt is for a good cause, to save rabbits, raccoons, even deer that are being eaten up by all these pythons.
A $31 billion ecosystem
fragmented the sandy upland habitats that gopher tortoises depend on. Tortoise populations collapsed, and the indigo lost its refuges. By the 1970s and 1980s, the eastern indigo had essentially vanished from the northern third of its range. Conservation organizations spent the following 4 decades working to restore the longleaf pine forests and scrub habitats the tortoises need, while captive breeding programs kept the indigo snake from disappearing entirely. The recovery work was slow and often discouraging. Then in late 2023, a trail camera at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle captured footage of 2 wild-born eastern indigo hatchlings moving through the leaf litter. These were not animals released from a captive breeding program. They were born in the wild to wild parents, the first confirmed wild reproduction of the species in that area in more than 50 years. The population is rebuilding from the north, and the snakes are beginning to expand their range southward. Their path is heading directly toward the territory currently held by the Burmese python. What happens when these two forces meet is one of the most closely watched questions in American conservation biology. The indigo snake evolved over millions of years to hunt and kill other snakes. It is faster, more agile, and behaviorally more sophisticated than the python. Where the python wins through sheer mass and constricting power, the indigo wins through speed, striking accuracy, and the ability to neutralize a prey animal's head before the fight develops. No confirmed video footage of an indigo snake attacking a Burmese python in the wild exists yet, but the biology strongly suggests the indigo could become a meaningful predator of juvenile and subadult pythons in the areas where their ranges overlap. No other animal in North America has the combination of size, predatory specialization, and venom immunity that would allow it to hunt pythons consistently and safely, rebuilding their population and expanding south. The indigo snake, like every other native snake except the cottonmouth, may have no innate resistance to Raleigh orientalis. If the indigo moves south into parasite-saturated territory and begins dying from lungworm infections before it can establish a breeding population in python country, the recovery of 4 decades of conservation work could be unraveled by an organism too small to see. The three-way collision between the python, the indigo snake, and the lungworm is the defining biological event now unfolding in Florida, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the Everglades is not passive. Bobcats, which were decimated by python predation, have begun to adapt. In a remarkable documented case, a 25-pound bobcat was captured on a trail camera stalking, attacking, and killing a python that outweighed it by more than double. The cat approached from an angle that prevented the snake from coiling and used a precise bite to the head to incapacitate it. Alligators, which for years seemed to coexist with pythons in an uneasy truce, are increasingly being documented ambushing pythons in the water. Hawks and osprey have been filmed taking young pythons from open ground. The native community is learning, and behavioral learning at the population level is one of the most powerful forces in ecology. The Everglades is the largest subtropical wilderness in the United States. It is worth $31 billion a year not as an abstraction, but as a working system that filters water, buffers storms, stores carbon, and sustains fisheries that feed millions of people. Losing it to an invasive reptile and a microscopic parasite is not an acceptable outcome for Florida or for the country. The next few years will reveal whether the return of the eastern indigo snake, the surprising resilience of the cottonmouth, and the adaptive learning of the native predator community are enough to tip the balance. The war is not over, but for the first time in 30 years, it is a war with 2 sides. There is a war happening right now in one of the most valuable and fragile places on the entire planet. It is not being fought with guns or technology. It is being fought with scales, venom, and millions of years of evolution. The battlefield is the Florida Everglades, a place that most people dismiss as nothing more than a hot, buggy swamp sitting at the bottom of the United States. But this swamp is not just mud and mosquitoes. It is a living, breathing, financial and ecological powerhouse worth over $31 billion every single year. And for the past 3 decades, it has been quietly losing a war that nobody voted for and nobody planned. The enemy is the Burmese python, a massive constrictor from Southeast Asia that has turned the heart of Florida into its personal hunting ground. But something is changing. The ecosystem is waking up, and the python's days may finally be numbered. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what the Everglades actually does. Most people walk past a wetland and see nothing. Scientists walk past the same wetland and see an engineering marvel that no human could ever replicate. The Everglades sits directly on top of the Biscayne Aquifer, the underground water supply that provides drinking water to more than 8 million people across South Florida. Without the filter effect of the wetland above it, that aquifer would either run dry or become contaminated with salt water from the Atlantic Ocean. The swamp catches every drop of rain that falls on it, processes that water slowly through layers of soil, grass, and limestone, and delivers clean groundwater to millions of homes. If the state of Florida had to build an artificial system to replace that function, the cost would be staggering and likely impossible. Studies from 2025 and 2026 have updated the valuation of these combined ecosystem services to exceed $31 billion annually when you factor in water filtration, flood control from hurricanes and tropical storms, carbon storage in the peat and sawgrass, fishery productivity in the connected coastal waters, and the tourism economy that draws millions of visitors each year. This is not a swamp. This is a machine, and someone broke it. In the middle of all this destruction, however, researchers noticed something unexpected. The Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper that lives in the same muddy, frog-filled waters as many of the affected species, appeared to be entirely unaffected by the lungworm. Survey after survey found cottonmouths in areas of heavy parasite pressure with clean, healthy lungs. Scientists are still working to understand the mechanism behind this resistance, but the leading hypotheses involve either a highly effective innate immune response that neutralizes the larvae before they can migrate, or some biochemical property of the cottonmouth's blood or venom chemistry that is toxic to the parasite. Genetic research is ongoing to identify the specific genes or proteins responsible. If the biological basis for the cottonmouth's resistance can be understood, it may eventually be possible to use that knowledge to protect other vulnerable species, or to develop biological tools to suppress the lungworm population. The cottonmouth, a snake that most Floridians fear and avoid, may turn out to be the key to saving the state's reptile community. But the most dramatic development in the Everglades recovery story is the return of the eastern indigo snake. The indigo is the longest native snake species in North America, capable of reaching 8 or 9 feet in length, and it belongs to a behavioral category that biologists call Ophiophagus, meaning it specializes in hunting and consuming other snakes. The indigo does not use constriction. It grabs prey with a powerful bite from its thick-skulled, heavily muscled head and swallows it whole while the prey is still alive. It is also completely immune to the venom of every native venomous snake in Florida, including the eastern diamondback rattlesnake and the cottonmouth, which means it can prey on species that would be dangerous to most other predators. The indigo snake was historically present throughout Florida and into parts of Georgia and Alabama, and it was the apex snake predator of the southeastern pine forest ecosystem. The situation became significantly more complicated when researchers discovered that the Burmese python was not traveling alone. Hitching a ride inside the bodies of the invasive snakes was a parasitic lungworm called Raleodiella orientalis, a nematode parasite native to Southeast Asia. Burmese pythons coexist with this parasite without severe harm because they evolved alongside it over millions of years. Florida's native snake species had no such evolutionary preparation. The lungworm moves through the environment through an indirect pathway. Infected pythons shed parasite eggs in their waste. Small invertebrates like cockroaches and beetles ingest the eggs, frogs and lizards eat the invertebrates, and native snakes eat the frogs. Once inside a naive host, the larvae migrate out of the digestive tract, penetrate tissue, and travel to the lungs, where they anchor and feed, growing to a size that can physically obstruct breathing. Researchers examining infected native snakes found individuals so heavily parasitized that their lung tissue was almost entirely replaced by masses of white worms. Death by suffocation was the end result in severe cases. Dr. Cristina Ramagosa at the University of Florida documented the spread of this parasite across at least 19 species of native Florida snakes. The finding that most alarmed scientists was that the lungworm had already established transmission cycles between native snake species, meaning the parasite no longer required the Burmese python to persist. It was spreading on its own, and it had been detected as far north as Jacksonville, hundreds of miles beyond the python's current range. If every python in Florida were removed tomorrow, the lungworm would remain. It is a permanent addition to Florida's biology, and there is currently no practical way to reverse its presence across a landscape of millions of acres. Florida's response to this crisis went through several phases, and most of them failed. The state launched the Python Elimination Program, which hired professional contractors to locate and remove snakes year-round. As of the most recent reporting, those contractors have removed more than 23,000 snakes since the program began in 2017. That sounds impressive until you consider that the estimated python population in South Florida ranges between 100,000 and 300,000 animals. Professional removal is catching perhaps 5 to 10% of the total population annually at best, and pythons breed faster than they can be caught. The Florida Python Challenge, an annual competitive hunting event that draws hundreds of participants, generated significant media coverage, but removed only 195 snakes in its 2024 competition, a number that barely registers against the total population. Technology has also largely failed in the Everglades environment. Thermal imaging drones, which have been used successfully to track warm-blooded animals in other habitats, cannot detect pythons because the snakes are cold-blooded and match the ambient temperature of the surrounding vegetation and water. The snakes are essentially invisible to infrared sensors when resting, which is most of the time. Acoustic detection, GPS tracking of individual snakes, and even experimental lure systems using live prey scents have all produced limited results at scale. The Judas snake program, which involves implanting radio transmitters in captured males and releasing them to lead researchers to breeding aggregations, has proven useful for finding large groups of snakes during mating season. But the method is expensive, slow, and cannot come close to covering the full extent of python territory. More recently, researchers have observed pythons actively moving away from roads, levees, and other areas where human activity is concentrated, suggesting the snakes are learning to avoid human pressure. The python is not just a biological problem. It is an adaptive biological problem. The Everglades, almost all of them survived. The population grew exponentially through the late 1990s and early 2000s, and by the time wildlife managers understood the scale of the problem, the pythons had already colonized millions of acres. The ecological damage they caused was documented in a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. Researchers drove systematic transects across the park, counting every animal they observed, and compared those numbers to historical baselines. What they found was catastrophic. In the areas of the park where pythons had been established the longest, raccoon populations had fallen by more than 99%. Opossum observations dropped by nearly 99% as well. Marsh rabbits had essentially disappeared from large sections of the southern Everglades. Bobcat sightings were down by nearly 90%. These were not gradual declines spread over centuries of habitat change. This was a rapid, near-total erasure of the mammal community across thousands of square miles in a matter of years. The swamp that once rustled and hummed with the constant movement of small animals fell into an eerie silence. Scientists who had worked in the Everglades for decades described walking through areas that felt completely empty, stripped of life in a way that felt unnatural and deeply disturbing. The collapse of small mammals created cascading problems throughout the ecosystem. Mammals like raccoons, possums, and rabbits play critical roles in seed dispersal, insect control, and as prey for the birds of prey and larger carnivores that depend on them. When those mammals disappeared, the animals above them in the food chain also began to struggle. The great blue heron, the roseate spoonbill, the wood stork, all of these species depend on a healthy prey base that runs through the mammal community. The python had not just eaten the swamp. It had quietly dismantled the machine that kept $31 billion of ecosystem services running every year. The story of how the Burmese python arrived in Florida has 2 chapters, and most people only know one of them. The first chapter involves Hurricane Andrew, which devastated South Florida in August of 1992 with winds exceeding 165 miles per hour. Among the many structures flattened by that storm was a reptile breeding and import facility near the edge of the Everglades. The walls came down, the cages broke open, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons slipped into the sawgrass and disappeared. That is the dramatic origin story that gets told in documentaries. But the second chapter is quieter and arguably worse. Throughout the 1990s, the exotic pet trade in the United States was booming, and Burmese pythons were one of the most popular animals being sold. A hatchling python could be purchased at a reptile expo for less than $20. They were small, they were impressive, and they seemed like an exciting pet. The problem was that these snakes do not stay small. Within a few years, a python that once fit in a shoebox can reach 12 feet in length and weigh more than 100 pounds. Faced with an animal they could no longer safely house or afford to feed, thousands of pet owners across Florida made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. They drove to the edge of the Everglades, opened their car doors, and let the snakes go. They believed they were being merciful. What they were actually doing was arming an invasion. The Everglades was the ideal environment for these animals to not just survive, but explode in population. The climate of South Florida closely mirrors the tropical